is made possible by the Canola School, the Soybean School, and Nutrien eKonomics. Looking for the best ag knowledge from top-notch industry experts? Join Mike Howell on Season 3 of The Dirt, an eKonomics podcast. From nutrient management to the latest weather, market, and ag trends, The Dirt is your place for farm-smart topics to help boost profitability. Dig in and listen to The Dirt on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or visit nutrien-economics.com. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Agronomists. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith. So glad you could join us. We've got a great show lined up for you tonight. We're going to be talking about white mold of soybeans and Sclerotinia of canola because, yes, they're in fact the same disease, same pathogen, just showing up on different crops. Before we get to that, of course, a quick reminder, if you collect those CEU credits, head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists. Let us know you took in the show and we'll get you those credits for sure. Also, let us know where you're joining us from and how things are looking where you are. Thanks to many who are jumping in already, letting us know where they're at with planting and with seeding. And my heart does go out to quite a few of you in Western Canada. While the moisture is certainly welcome in many areas, there's definitely some acres that need to get planted, and the water just doesn't stop in parts of Manitoba anyway, Saskatchewan, and even Alberta. So there you go. All right, let's hop to our discussion. Tonight, we've got Chris Manchur with the Canola Council of Canada and Rob Miller of BASF. Hello, Chris. Hello, Rob.
Good evening.
Hey, Lyndsey.
All righty. Okay, so I am super excited to chat about this. This is one of those super fun diseases. That's what we're going to call it, right? But let's start with, of course, what's happening this week where you are. So, Chris, what's keeping you busy with the Canola Council this week? How do crops look out in Manitoba where you are?
Well, you caught me on one of these few days where I didn't actually see any rain, which is quite a surprise because we've been getting lots of it in Manitoba. That's been delaying some of the seeding, but at the same time, there's been lots of calls about a few bit of flea beetle feeding here and there, some soil crusting issues. Hopefully those things will get resolved later on. But overall, for those who've got seed in the ground, can breathe a little bit of a sigh of relief. But we got to keep on top of those weeds a bit because they're popping up now too.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Do you, I've talked to a couple farmers in the area. They're glad to be as advanced as they are, given how challenging this season has been. Do you get a sense of how quick things would wrap up here if we got some decent weather?
I think it still depends on a regional basis right now. I know north of Winnipeg right now in the Interlake, it is still pretty behind with seeding. However, most of the other areas are doing quite well. So in terms of how quick we can wrap up, I think if we can get a few dry days on the soil there, we can get going pretty good. But I mean, the seeding deadlines are fast approaching, so got to keep an eye out for that.
Yeah, for sure. Jay Wetter joins us and says he took a drive today. Lots of wet fields in the Red River Valley. That is definitely, I will say, though, it's one of those areas. It's where I'm from. That you're right, Chris. A few beautiful sunny days with a nice wind, and they can dry out pretty quickly and get rolling. So we'll see how it goes. Now, over here in Ontario, as I like to call it, Rob, there are areas that are very happy and some areas that are not very happy. You're further south than I am. How do things look where you are, Rob?
Yeah, so I'm based in Guelph, and I would say overall Guelph, we've been not bad. We've been able to get the majority of the crop in the ground, corn, beans. We had a little bit of a nice stretch where we were able to get first cut off. But there's other parts of the province, especially Lambton County and some of the heavier clays down there, down in Essex. They still haven't turned a wheel or just, we're switching out from corn and going to soybeans now, and only 0 to 20% of the beans in the ground. So it's kind of depends on the soil type and the where the soil is heavier. That's where it keeps getting the rains.
Yeah.
So we're just starting to get into dry beans in this area in North London, but there's still lots of pockets and stuff. And wheat looks good. And again, today was the sun came out around 3 o'clock today, so we'll celebrate. But rain all week. So.
Yeah, we had here on the east, and we're definitely going to talk quite a bit about Eastern Canada's or Eastern Ontario's challenges with white mold, I'll call them. We did get 4 or 5 days of sun. We did, lots of us have first cut in, including our farm, which is pretty amazing for our home farm anyway. So, I mean, it's there, but definitely the forecast doesn't look super friendly for many who are really struggling to get the last of the crop in. So, and yes, for those asking about Lambton, I've got friends down there as well. Talk to them, and you're right, Rob. On some of those heavy clays, like there's very little, if anything, that's gone in.
Yep. And they
Yeah.
keep getting the rain. So, but
Yeah, and lots of it. Okay,
Yep.
so let's assume then I'm kidding. We're never going to assume that everything shall remain as it is, but let's unpack here. We are talking about Sclerotinia of canola, white mold of soybeans, and of course some other crops as well, which we'll talk about. It is the same pathogen, just sometimes shows up a bit differently, and we have to manage it perhaps somewhat differently, but there's a lot of similarities between the crop types and the conditions that really favor this disease. Chris, I'll start with you. When we're putting together sort of our risk profile of those fields, is it really moisture driven, or is there more to it than just whether or not we end up with a humid or wet season?
I would say when you take a look at canola, Sclerotinia is probably the one that is the most moisture driven. And when I'm talking about moisture, I think there's many ways we can kind of look at it. You know, we're taking a look at relative humidity, we're taking a look at the amount of rain we've had, the soil moisture conditions. All these things definitely play a huge role into determining how severe that Sclerotinia can be for that year. We kind of have a few assumptions that we know, especially in canola situations where most of our canola is susceptible to most degrees. And then also we know that the Sclerotinia is there in the soil. The sclerotia can stay over for many years. So automatically when we're taking a look at that disease triangle, that already satisfies two of the conditions. What's the thing that's left? The environment, and the moisture is the primary driver.
Mm-hmm. I do love a good disease triangle. I won't lie. So Rob, I did. It's called foreshadowing. I mentioned Eastern Ontario. We tend to dodge the bullet on gibberella and corn at times, but we do
Yep.
not dodge the bullet on white mold and soybeans. What is it about Eastern Ontario that makes us so susceptible to this disease?
Yeah, and I think it really comes down to that you have that perfect environment, and parts of the disease triangle, you have the host and the environment, and it just seems every year there's always parts of Eastern Ontario that gets it, and I think it really comes down to the relative humidity at night. We actually had some weather stations out last year, so in 2023 2023 was probably the worst white mold year that we've ever probably seen in Eastern Ontario, upwards of 20 to 25 bushel yield loss in soybeans, and we actually tracked some of our weather stations, and you had that nice thick dense canopy. Your fertility is great. You have a little bit cooler nights as well, and you just have that high relative humidity where the plant really never dries out, and you walk the fields at noon or 2 o'clock, your pant legs are still getting wet. So that's the optimal environment for white mold. So kind of like how we have tar spot in southwestern Ontario, and down by London, Rodney always gets tar spot. You're pretty much the white mold hotspot in soybeans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that. It's gross, I'll be honest. But so there's the wet pants test, which is very technical, everybody. When we walk through and there is that moisture in the canopy, but it is true, right? Is that it's not just about whether or not it rained, it's about whether or not there's humidity in the canopy. So Chris, how important is that for farmers to pay attention to as far as leading up to potentially that spray timing for Sclerotinia if they're going to make that call?
Right. So spray timing for Sclerotinia usually happens around that 10, 20 to 50% flowering time. So you have to pay attention what's leading up to that, right? We know certain conditions can happen at points in time, like say a big 3-inch rain, but it's these sustained conditions over, about 2 weeks that you really have to pay attention leading up to that decision for spraying. And really what we've seen, and this is kind of supported by some recent research by Kelly Turkington, is that you kind of need the sustained 80% relative humidity in the canopy, not in ambient relative humidity, to actually kind of continue that, and which Rob mentioned too, right? So when we're taking a look at, having weather stations, and if you can monitor that to actually see if it's sustained or not, or if you have that kind of microclimate conditions in there, that's what it really needs to actually germinate this apothecia, these fungal bodies that will actually throw those spores up into the air.
Now, this is, as you mentioned, so these little sclerotia, they germinate, they make these little mushrooms, they throw up all those spores. how long can they rest for? Like, are we talking, like, I guess the second part to that question is, can rotation actually be a powerful tool or just a useful tool?
I'd say it's a really great tool and also can be your greatest enemy too. If you have tight rotations with host crops, which is, canola, soy, sunflowers, even potatoes, a lot of broadleaf crops really, that's going to continue recycling that sclerotia into the ground. In terms of rotation too, we've had a few really dry years across the prairies. And so that sclerotia may still be hiding there, but it's also fairly dry conditions as well. So it's kind of almost like in a desiccated state where it can just bide its time and then germinate when those conditions are actually optimal. So just because we may have been getting away with maybe less Sclerotinia than previous years like 2016 here in the prairies doesn't mean that it's not going to come back this year.
Mm-hmm. Now, Rob, we have excellent 3-crop rotations across Ontario. And no one strays from that. I'm being somewhat facetious at this point. But to that point, we do also have edible beans in rotation. There are some sunflowers in the province as well, all of which can host this. So for areas that white mold has been a problem, is this a conversation that sort of from the get-go you're having with your soybean growers as to what their plan is for white mold?
Definitely. So rotation does obviously help. It helps break up that cycle, but I think just it's adapting to some of our agronomic practices. So, generally with tillage, if you do some form of tillage, we would incorporate that sclerotia, those little rat turds on the soil, and they remain viable for multiple years, like 5-6 years down the road. So that's where we've gone to shifted to more high speed discs, whereas 10-15 years ago we were doing a lot more no-till soybeans. Now with the big corn crops we have, we're incorporating the sclerotia, and it remains viable for a number of years. So I think rotation does help, but there's also a lot of weeds that are hosts as well. Driving around this year, it's Mother Nature's cover crop has been chickweed. And you see even now the fields that haven't been planted are just covered in chickweed. It's already kind of set seed. That's actually a host for white mold. And there's several other weed species, most of, as Chris mentioned, most of the broadleaf crops and also the broadleaf weeds are hosts as well. So, if you don't do a really good job of weed control or taking care of the entire package, you're still going to have this pop up every 2 to 3 years.
So Jason has a good question about where we leave that sclerotia. So Rob, are you saying if we leave it on the soil surface, break up stems and leave it there, will more of them die off versus burying them, or what are we doing there?
So in general, if you leave them on the soil surface, they will dry out and help reduce the potential. And it doesn't definitely eliminate. You still can get a white mold in no-till soybeans, but in general, they tend not to last as long when you leave them on the soil surface.
Okay, so then the alternative to that, Chris, is how long can they last if they've got a happy little home a few inches in the soil? 10 years?
They could potentially last up to that. There may not be many left, but kind of the general rule that we're seeing is at least 5 years where you'll have that viability. Okay. Another thing to add too is that the microbial environment also plays a role in degrading the sclerotia. So if you have a really active environment, that's maybe in those top few centimeters of soil, that could help degrade the sclerotia as well. And actually that's kind of inspired a couple biological products that actually degrade the sclerotia rather than actually protect it during the season.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you mentioned that, because we do have a few interesting products that have been around quite a while that are they're a different way to think about disease protection, right? And that the one that Contans, I think is the name, you actually apply it to the field to bring down the sclerotia count. So I can see a fit for it. But I mean, I remember doing a story on that quite some time ago. It's still around. Any thoughts, Rob, on and Chris as well, on why we don't see perhaps more of it? Is it just too challenging, too expensive? Why don't we see more of that use?
Yeah, I think the entire industry is still figuring out biologicals, and I think with something like this with Catens, we've done a bit of research on it, and it is fairly expensive. But in some of those areas like Eastern Ontario, where you have a 3 to 5 year rotation, and you're still getting white mold that gets wiping out your crop. I think that's the scenario where we'd want to use it in those really high risk scenarios. And we're actually have a few sites out there where we're doing, 20-acre blocks or 10-acre blocks in the center of the field. You hear different things, and I think we're starting to figure it out. Usually works better the year before you actually plant the soybeans. It seems to be the year of planting soybeans doesn't seem as effective. It doesn't allow the biological to work as effectively. So we're kind of still in the early stages and figuring out, what year would you do it in the fall? Do you do it in the spring?
Right.
What type of crops are in your rotation? But it's definitely not for every field widespread, but definitely potentially could be an option in some of those extremely high risk fields.
Chris, do you get questions about contents ever?
Not really. A kind of chief mode of control is foliar fungicides in the season, and kind of Rob alluded to, you have to decide, when are you going to apply these things, and that kind of relates to, assessing your risk for that Sclerotinia, especially in, say, Western Canada, where you may have a year or scenario where you may want to apply fungicide or not, rather than maybe in Eastern Canada, where it's more of a kind of a rule that you wouldn't be applying a fungicide. So in terms of making that decision and then maintaining your profitability, that fungicide in crop is usually a little bit more attractive.
Warren does share, and thanks for weighing in here, Warren, because I knew that he had used it. It's a multi-year product for sure, and very expensive, but it definitely works if you follow the labels. So Rob, to your point, certainly I would think if you've got, edible beans in rotation, if you've got those fields that, just maybe you just know they're going to be an issue, perhaps it just becomes one of those other tools in the toolbox. Okay, so we've got some great slides, and we've got a couple video clips as well. So I want to talk about varieties first before we go to the clip, because then we're going to talk about canopies. But let's just back up one step here to talk about the actual hybrid or variety that we put in the ground. Chris, you alluded to the fact that we maybe don't have great Sclerotinia options for resistance. So I'll start with you first. Where are we at as far as how farmers might be able to choose a variety that could make a difference?
Yeah, so we've made pretty significant strides, I would say, in the past 10 years in terms of getting some Sclerotinia resistance. It is a very uphill battle because usually there isn't much natural resistance in plants. We see this because it preys on so many different species. But, in terms of what we have on the market right now, there are some varieties that actually provide a good degree of protection. However, it's not as complete as, say, our foliar fungicide options. Yet, where we're building towards, and there's many different ways we're actually going to get to Sclerotinia resistance, sounds pretty promising. And I think that'd be a good time to show up slide 3 that I provided to kind of talk about where we're heading, actually, in terms of some Sclerotinia resistance. So not to be shocked, but this is a bit of a busy slide, but I want to just take a look at the right chart for at least the beginning. Each little point, this isn't a time chart, but in this one research project, we actually took a look at a whole bunch of different isolates collected across the prairies. And I believe this was collected in 2010. And we saw that there's actually quite a range in terms of susceptibility or aggressiveness of Sclerotinia isolates across there. And then we took a look at, this was work done by AFC in Saskatoon. There's one that's noted PAC 93, which is actually going to be probably one of our most promising candidates to integrate some Sclerotinia resistance into today's canola. And there's some research happening right now to evaluate that a bit more. So in terms of conventional breeding, there's a lot that's happening right now. And then there's other things too. Say on the left, we see a couple stem cuttings as well as a couple leaves. And this actually came from the same lab with some of my colleagues when I was doing my graduate studies. And this is using that RNA interference that we've seen in multiple species beyond canola that's actually proving to be quite effective against Sclerotinia. So we have that, we have conventional breeding, and also I think it was recently announced even CBAS is looking at gene editing to protect canola from Sclerotinia. So many different approaches. Little early to tell which is actually going to come out on top and be broadly adopted by the market. But it's nice that we have a few tools in our tool bag that we could potentially use in the future.
Yeah, I think it was just last week, CBAS made that official announcement that they're working at moving, so that's some gene editing technology, working on getting some Sclerotinia resistance into canola. So exciting stuff. Now, Rob, when we're considering our soybean varieties, is there a better story in soybeans, or is it just less worse?
Uh, I think it's white mold in soybeans is one of the hardest diseases to get research on. Like, if you don't want to have white mold in your soybeans, we'll do a plot. It's guaranteed you won't get it in that field. So it grows in patches, and it all just
Right.
depends on there's no field that's there was last year, but it's not very common to get an entire field that's wiped out, that's uniform across the entire region. So it's really tough to get good white mold data from the soybean varieties, but you just have to rely on the seed company data. They have the years of experience. We're putting out a lot of new soybean varieties as well, and that's where some might work. The research that we do on white mold in southwestern Ontario may not work in Ontario or Quebec as well, in eastern Ontario or Quebec. So. Or sometimes they do all that research in the U.S. as well, and it's you're breeding it more for frog eye leaf spot down in the U.S. versus white mold.
Frog eye leaf spot sounds cooler, so I would probably support that one too, Rob. Sorry about your luck. So we might have to adapt that a little bit. Yeah, exactly.
Easier to do research on.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so this is one of the diseases we don't necessarily have a lot of choices on the variety or hybrid side that may have an impact, but there are a lot of decisions that farmers and agronomists have to make as far as the canopy and the actual plant population, etc. So producer Jay, if you would, let's play our first clip. This is Albert Tenuta in a soybean school talking about building this beautiful canopy to grow beautiful white mold.
Is this problematic? In your definition of a good canopy and managing white mold, what do you see here?
Oh, I see potential there for white mold for sure. And you also have to think about the history of it. Have we had white mold in the past? Is there the Sclerotia there? Those things play an important factor into this. And definitely this, the row spacing here, the plant populations, a beautiful even canopy here. We have other fields where, they're waist high already. And those are ideal canopy situations or developments that can promote white mold.
You're going to get that moisture, you're going to get that environment for disease. Albert, here's a question for you. Can we make this canopy better from a management perspective for next year? Should we choose different rows, maybe change up our varieties? How can we make this better for managing white mold?
Yeah, so that's a tough question because it's a fine balance, right? Because you want to, everything you're doing here to get that maximize that canopy is for maximizing yield. At the same time, you're influencing the white mold. So there's that balance. How do you maximize yield while lowering your white mold risk? And so starts with, row spacing. These are 15-inch soybeans. You could go to 30, more and more 30s we're starting to see as well, and that's one way of doing it. But again, on 15s you can lower your plant population. You can get your varieties. We don't have really truly resistant varieties, and even tolerance is so. What we're talking about is the architecture, those more upright beans, architecture soybeans versus those bushy ones. Those ones can help us in terms of reducing that favorable environment in there, allow more air movement through, etc. Lowering those plant populations. So instead of, 180 to 220 or higher, you're that 120, 130, even lower than that. There's a lot of work being done where down to 100,000. But again, you've got to know your fields. You got to take that risk as well there. So lowering those plant populations, widening those rows, selecting the right variety, knowing your history, that is a key as well. All of those things can influence those sclerotia in the soil and whether or not they increase their risk for that they'll infect those blossoms.
Yeah. So it's all about managing risk and managing, yield and finding that fine line between, as I say, disease and yield.
Yeah, and then the fungicides in there as well, right? Yeah. And that whole timing.
Exactly. A big part of the story, but it all starts in the canopy, right?
It does.
Our sponsors tonight are Nutrien eKonomics, the Canola School, and the Soybean School. The Soybean School on Real Agriculture is an agronomy and issues video series that allows soybean growers to learn on their own time, at their own pace, in order to become better growers in the long term. The Soybean School is made possible by support from Syngenta Canada and BASF. All right, so Jay Wetter, you are reading my mind, so that's scary, just so you know. But the discussion of a canopy, we've talked about the relative humidity, we've talked about the conditions within that canopy, but Rob and Chris, I want to turn this question differently for you, but Rob, when we talk canopy, and Albert mentioned architecture of those plants, are you seeing producers like here in the East moving to those 30-inch rows, trying to keep air movement through that canopy? Or are they choosing more upright, less bushy plants? How are farmers kind of trying to set up a canopy for success, but still keep that yield in sight?
Yeah, I think a lot of growers are kind of, hybrid selection is the most important. So I think, we're always managing for maximized yield. I would say that, even in some situations, going to 30-inch rows, that's going to lower your yield potential. Like we've tried some of that stuff, especially in Eastern Ontario, and the yield potential isn't there as much. That might change with some of these newer varieties that we have on the market, but research that we did 10, 15 years ago, we still couldn't get that yield potential. The thing is, when you introduce wider row soybeans, you introduce other factors. So crop canopy is your friend when it comes to managing weeds and weed resistance. So, you try to control white mold, but then you might have that lower yield potential, and then you're going to have to be spraying more herbicides to manage the weeds because you don't have that crop canopy as quickly. And as we're dealing with some of these heavy resistant weeds here in Ontario and across Eastern Canada, it's kind of that balance and act. So you got to find that sweet spot. You pick the variety that you like, you know your field history, and then you kind of tailor that to the plant population and row spacing. And every year is going to be different. 30-inch rows might work this year, 15s will work next year, 20 might be the sweet spot, and that's going guaranteed that's going to change every year. So.
Mm-hmm. Now, Chris, this is why I wanted to change this question a little bit, because it feels like with canola, so often, we know that canola adapts, fills a lot of space, so we want to end up with that 5 to 8 plants of that target plant stand, let's say, but they're gonna branch like crazy. It becomes that just absolute knitted, beautiful crop by the end of the year. And some of them have leaves on them. Some of these varieties, they're like dinner plates, like they're just huge and beautiful and amazing. So, can we ask this question in a way for the West on, can you actually make good decisions for the canopy that don't negatively impact yield, or is it, as Rob says, some of these changes are going to potentially cap your yield?
Yeah, there's kind of a balancing act there, right? I mean, we've definitely been trending towards lower plant populations in recent years, which is good because it does have that compensation. There's definitely those drawbacks in terms of covering that space. Things you got to consider also, like, and we'll talk about this more maybe, but the petals are falling down and then they're falling onto the canopy, or more specifically into these nodes where the stems are branching off. So if you have a very branched plant, you may actually only have partial infection on some of the Sclerotinia. Whereas if maybe you have more upright plants where these petals can fall straight down because it's not captured by these upper branches, then you get a basal infection. And then essentially once that Sclerotinia hits the base, game's over because it'll take over the whole plant. So there's a bit of a balancing act there in terms of that. The other thing to consider too is that if you have a very branched plant, you also have usually a wider window for flowering. And so all of a sudden you need to cover more petals over a longer period of time. And so the fungicide decision also becomes a little bit more challenging compared to, say, a very high plant stand that's going to flower all at the same time because it usually only has the one main branch in most cases, or very limited auxiliary branches. So there's different things to consider in terms of what you set out to do during seeding, or potentially how the crop advances later.
Producer Jay, can you bring up, Chris? I think it's your first slide, because you mentioned the stem sort of right at the base versus perhaps higher up on the plant, and the yield impact some of these may have. So on the left there, we're seeing that spot. So, and this is one of the things, and let's maybe talk about that right now. We spray to protect those petals because the petals are the food for this disease, right? So So talk me through then the difference between here of seeing it higher on the plant, lower on the plant, and the potential yield impact here.
Right. So the thing we have to keep in mind is that Sclerotinia is a very aggressive pathogen. It'll take over a plant fairly quickly once it actually gets in there. When we take a look at, say, on these two photos on the right, I had this photos taken when I was disease surveying in 2022, and we were talking a little bit before the show started, but you can smell when Sclerotinia is really bad, and this was the case in this field. So no matter what happened, likely there was going to be severe yield loss. However, the one on the left, or that center photo, that's that basal infection where you can start seeing it just kind of happen above the crown. And that's really where the disease is going to be bad. Further up the stem, I guess, even though it's inverse here, still looks green for now, but you're cutting off pretty much all the circulation there and all that flow of nutrients and water, after flowering to fill out those pods. What we see in the right photo here is that likely what happened is that we had a petal that fell right into that kind of crook right in between where it branches, and all of a sudden starting to infect from there. Now, likely this is still on the main stem, but it was further up. So potentially there may be some yield to be saved if we have some auxiliary branches that were coming further from the base, where it could still start to pull some nutrients through before it essentially does get overtaken, potentially if the conditions are good.
Now, Rob, I'll go to you in a second, but the center photo that shows that base, the base of the stem rotten, that can look like other diseases too. So how do I know that's Sclerotinia and not something else like, say, blackleg or verticillium or all these other diseases that canola gets? How do I know that's Sclerotinia?
Right. Right on a visual cue from here, yeah, it definitely can be challenging. There's so many others. Take a stem cutting. Take a look at what's actually going on inside. Usually there's going to be some other characteristic features of the other pathogens that you'll actually notice. Like in a case like blackleg, you'll actually see that there may be actually some necrosis, like actually black necrotic tissue starting to form. In Sclerotinia, it'll essentially be fairly pale for the longest part of time. We could also have some other kinds of molds that'll happen a little bit later on, but it won't be as aggressive. And you can almost see sometimes with Sclerotinia, you can kind of see almost concentric bands almost happening on that as it advances through, because it kind of continues to go once those conditions are, really favorable for it to advance. So, and then of course at the end of the season, revisit your field right after it's harvested or swath, take some stem cuttings, and if you see those little mouse turds hiding in the stubble, you've got Sclerotinia.
All right. Now, Producer Jay, if you could, let's go to Rob's slide 4, I want to say, because Warren's asked a great question. And when we think about canola, with all its big, beautiful yellow flowers, they're at the top of the canopy. We're going to fly on over or drive on over. We protect those flowers. We're good.
Yep.
Soybeans, however, have a whole bunch. They're almost the inverse, right? They have all these leaves and these little tiny flowers near the bottom. So when we choose a spray pass, are we still targeting flowers, or are we going after leaves? What do we want to target here?
Yeah, it's a great question. We always get it, and yeah, we still are targeting that flowers, the petals, because the petals are the food source, just like Chris mentioned, and they are stuck behind all the other trifoliates. They're right in the branches and the arches, and that's where you actually see the white mold develop, very similar to what Chris showed in canola, right at the base of the plant or right on the main stem. That's where the infection usually occurs. So that is probably the biggest challenges on some of these large soybean canopies, getting good coverage of the flowers. And I really like going at R2 or full bloom. So when we talk about, R1, that's when we see one flower anywhere on the plant. And soybeans are an indeterminate plant in Canada, so we know that they're going to be flowering by the night, the length of the night. So usually in that, first week and say the first week of July or so, depending on where you are in the province, that's where we're going to get it. And so R1, and then I like R2 as full bloom. So that is where we have one open flower on the two uppermost nodes, and then that's where full flower. That's where we generally see the window starting. You can go a little bit earlier, but I really like waiting till this, the full bloom, that R2 stage, and then that's the beginning of the window. And if your environmental conditions are conducive for disease, or you're in that high risk scenario, then you're looking at that second application, maybe 10 to 14 days later, depending on your risk tolerance as well. But you always like going there first. And I should say that fungicides should be your last line of defense for managing white mold in soybeans, because there's no silver bullets. It's very challenging. I also have a picture here of R2.5. So just to make things even more complicated, we're talking about R2 and R2.5 and R3. So we've kind of been doing some of this work with Dave Hooker at the University of Guelph probably about 10 years ago. And we found this little sweet spot where we start to see the pods at the bottom of the plant. Once you start to see them about a quarter inch, it's kind of that R2.5, because it's not really at R3 stage yet. So that's where we see the leaf disease protection as well, and those plant health benefits if you're not necessarily going after white mold, but it does seem to have a nice overlap as well. So that's where seems to be that nice sweet spot for the beginning of that window. And then say if you get another inch of rain or something 10 days after, then you might have to come in on some of those high risk fields, but that's not going to be a 2-pass program across every field by any means.
Mm-hmm. Chris, do you know of any farmers that do a 2-pass system for Sclerotinia?
I would probably say that a lot of the irrigated canola would definitely be seeing a 2-pass system. It really depends on your risk tolerance, like Rob mentioned. Okay. We may have some really great conditions for Sclerotinia development, and say, like I mentioned before, if we have really branching canola that's going to be flowering for a very long period of time, that's an excellent opportunity that you may have to go in and save it again. Really what it comes down to too is, assessing your yield potential as well. If you're taking a look at, you're starting to scout on your first pass, and this could be a 65, 70 bushel canola crop, that second pass definitely kind of checks all the boxes. If you're going to be saving some of that yield, it'll pay for it pretty quickly. But in terms of, if you're looking at, say, a 40 bushel crop or a 35 bushel crop, the conditions may just be good enough leading up to just one pass.
Mm-hmm. Now, so it really is, as much as it's the same disease, and there are similarities, just because of how different canola and soybeans are. We still, for canola, we want good coverage of those petals for sure, but for soybeans, we need to get in that canopy. So, Rob, what are you telling growers as far as how to make sure they're actually going to get product all the way down into the canopy for those flowers?
Yeah, number one would be higher water volumes, 20 gallons per acre minimum. I know everyone in Western Canada is going to laugh at us when we say 20 gallons, but that's kind of the standard program here. Some growers are actually looking at 25 gallons for some of those waist-high soybeans and those high-risk scenarios. So water volumes would be number one. Low and slow travel speeds, just like we try to recommend for fusarium head blight timing as well. Lowering that boom, you can do a better job of managing that boom height and getting across those acres. You don't want to have it flopping all over all over the place, just like if you have lots of hills and stuff like that. So slow down, control that boom height, and then pick the best nozzles. We've tried the forward and back, haven't had as much success. We're not covering the wheat head that's sticking up above the canopy and both sides of it. We're trying to get down into that canopy. So higher water volumes in general, some fine, medium to fine droplets or medium droplets tend to work better, but then you're at higher risk of off-target movement as well. So it's that balance and act. So, but those would be probably the best ones. So.
Jason weighs in from Manitoba saying the dry bean guys understand water volume, and that is true.
Yep.
That doesn't mean everybody is going to think 20 gallons and that they're going to go for it, but it is a different beast when we're thinking about what we're trying to protect between canola and soybeans for sure. Mark shares that they do spray twice, typically R1 and R2.5. Rob, just to recap, if you were to split, is that typically what you would see for a split, or would it be wider than that?
Yeah, like R1 is where you see just one flower petal on anywhere on the plant, and that's by the time you see that first one. So if you by the time you fill up the sprayer and wait, have your lunch, it might be closer to R1.5 to 2. So yeah, that's kind of the beginning of the way the window where you have lots of acres to cover. But again, the soybean will actually at that R2 stage, the soybean plant will actually start to double in height. So then if you get too later in the canopy, R3, let's say, it's tougher to get it down into that that canopy and cover those flowers. A soybean plant will flower for about 6 weeks. So that's where it's really tough to get across all these acres, and fungicides work best when applied preventatively.
Mm-hmm. So, Chris, that's always the question, certainly. And in a moment, we're going to go to a clip, and then we're going to talk about sort of tallying up all the ways that we can manage or measure our risk and see if we're going to go. But that call on the canola acres can be tough because, again, you're trying to protect those petals. You want a lot of them out so they actually get that spray pass, but you don't necessarily want to wait too long because it's a pretty tight window. So how do you manage that question of, as far as, how early should you be scouting and trying to line up that spray pass to target, that 30, 40, 50% bloom?
For canola, it can actually, once it starts bolting and starts throwing up some flowers, it'll advance fairly quickly to get to that, almost that optimal 30% flowering if you're going to be doing one application. But a lot of our products that are registered for Sclerotinia control in canola, they're ranging mostly from 20 to 50%. And actually there's some that are even going earlier than 10%, where there's some thoughts where the fungicide, if it's actually contacting the buds, will actually provide some degree of protection. A lot of the fungicides are contact based. There's fairly limited systemic effect. So that's why you need to really time that well. In terms of how you actually assess, what's that percent flowering, you really want to look at, say, your main raceme, your main stem, and actually count the amount of flowers on that. And usually once most of them are getting there, other than the main rosette, you're getting pretty close to that optimal spray time. This gets challenging as we were talking before, if you get a little bit more branching, and that kind of plays into the factor if you need to spray again.
Mm-hmm. I'll just put in a plug here for a Canola School from years ago that I did with Holly Dirksen, where she shows how to determine the proper spray timing. And it was a very hot day in a very yellow canola field, and she was very pregnant. And it's one of my favorite videos to this day. Anyway, go check it out. Okay, Producer Jay, if you would, we're going to go to, now this is a clip from 6 years ago, and there's a reason I pulled this one. This is with Mark Harding. It's a Canola School, because it does talk about a few of the tools that we have to potentially assess our risk for Sclerotinia, and I want to talk about what we're using now, and maybe if there's an update in the works on some of these tools. Producer Jay, if you would.
To sort of estimate the upcoming risk of Sclerotinia is to use things like petal tests. So there's new tools available to help growers sort of estimate the upcoming risk and need to spray. But the last way to do that is to use a checklist or a decision-making tool that will just kind of ask questions like, what's your rotation? What was the last time canola was here? How bad was the Sclerotinia? What's the weather forecast, etc. And you go through a series of questions, and you end up with a score that helps you make a decision as to whether or not you should spray. So scouting for Sclerotinia to assess risk is really challenging, and that's why there are these tools available to help growers either use decision-making tools or petal tests or biosensors to help kind of get an idea of how bad the risk is.
So once producers actually see the Sclerotinia, what can they do? What's the next step?
Yeah, so once you start to see symptoms, it's really too late to intervene. And so we have to use these predictive systems before the symptoms show up, because the fungicides only work to protect green tissue. And once we have lesions forming on the stems, it's too late. We can't cure them. So using Sclerotinia tolerant varieties and fungicides at the right time when the risk is there will help. But because of the nature of Sclerotinia, we probably won't ever eradicate it. We don't have complete genetic resistance, and because it can complete its life cycle on so many other crops, it's probably something we're going to have to do our best with. And as new tools and new products come available, hopefully we can get better at managing it. But once we start to see the symptoms, it's too late. The damage will be done.
The Agronomist is brought to you by the Soybean School, Nutrien eKonomics, and the Canola School. From pre-seeding, seeder setup and checks, to pest identification, and advice on nutrient management decisions, to tips on determining swath timing, Real Agriculture's Canola School is a video series that tackles every facet of the canola growing season in an engaging and informative format. The Canola School is made possible through sponsorship by BASF Canada and Invigor Hybrid Canola. Learn more at canolaschool.com. All right, so when we're determining, we've got some good slides for this as well, but we've talked a bit about, field history. We've talked a bit about what we can and can't do with our varieties, but really it does come down to the environment, and it comes down to, the environment leading up to flowering, for sure. So Chris, in looking at that from 6 years ago, do we have any major updates as far as petal tests or assessing our risk? What tools do farmers have and agronomists have for this disease?
Yeah, this is a great opportunity. We could throw up my second slide. We kind of talk about, we can almost have a layered approach in terms of how we actually want to assess Sclerotinia risk. And there's many, many ways to do it. And I kind of like looking at it almost from a top-down approach, where we have things nowadays like remote sensing and satellite imagery that kind of plays into that with NDVI, as well as other potential climatic factors into that. And they're kind of represented by the satellite called Sentinel-2, which feeds into a lot of systems. Rob went and talked a little bit about weather stations, an excellent resource for those areas where we want to measure other things such as relative humidity, potentially soil moisture or precipitation, as a matter of fact. And then, of course, the wet pants test, walking through your fields, getting assessment and getting that feel for actually what that microclimate is almost all too important. You actually need to be in those fields to actually get a good assessment. And then, a last thing, and then there's a few different ways that are kind of gaining a little bit more mainstream approaches. Say the petal testing option, where you're actually collecting petals ahead of time, sending them away to get tested for the DNA presence of Sclerotinia, as well as potentially some new research from Susie Lee from Innotech Alberta, who's developing, in this bottom left photo, a Sclerotinia biosensor that actually can measure the ascospores that are in the air, spore by spore, and actually, send a text message to your phone and notify you as the spore levels actually get greater and greater. So that's still in development right now, but looks pretty promising. So there's a lot of different things that you can kind of put together to actually develop a kind of a full picture. And especially when you're in high risk areas, or you're kind of on that threshold, whether you need to make a decision or not, it's good to layer some of these together to help you make that decision.
Mm-hmm. I just hope that when those texts come in, they are very foreboding and are like a zombie apocalypse is upon us. Because really, it's a missed opportunity if it's not very dramatic. But it is cool, and there is we have Susie Lee on an upcoming Canola School to talk about this box in the field, and this is something that farmers will have on their own farms, potentially, and are quite affordable, which is pretty neat. Rob, what do we have as far as, you mentioned weather station data, definitely important. What do Ontario growers often look to as far as assessing the risk? Is it strictly weather? What are we looking at?
Yeah, I think it comes down to a couple things. So number one would be the environment. So I guess maybe if we do have time, we can go to slide 3 that I have.
Yes. Yep.
On because it really comes down to conditioning the sclerotia. So it's not like the sclerotia just appear and kind of turn to the apothecia and it happens really fast. We always like to what we call conditioning the sclerotia. So that's really 8 weeks of moderate temperatures inside that thick, dense canopy. And if you remember, the relative humidity is always 10% at least higher in the canopy than it is above the canopy, and the temperature is a lot cooler as well. So if you have those more moderate temperatures leading up to the apothecia, because then the sclerotia will turn into the apothecia, and only about 25% of the sclerotia will actually germinate and create the apothecia, those little mushrooms. And once this process starts, and it usually happens, it's not, everyone thinks it's rainfall, but as Chris mentioned earlier, it's more relative humidity and what's happening inside that micro environment. So it usually happens 3 to 4 days after a rainfall event, as the temperatures start to, the starts to evaporate, the canopy starts to trap that, and then it really comes down to that leaf wetness. And once this process starts, it really rapidly increases, and they can start to have new apothecia, new lesions start to appear every 4 hours, even in that perfect environment. So that's where one spore, one of those apothecias can actually last for 20 to 40 days, but they're actually average around 9 days. And once this, and it usually is more localized, so they just kind of release those spores, and it goes into that it can travel about 150 meters, 200 meters. So it just might go to the neighboring field, but it's not like it's stripe rust that blows in from the US. So I think we do have some tools. But I like using this. I always like saying Jerome Gagne, long-term BASF rep in the Ottawa Valley, he said, when grass is green, white mold's keen. And if your grass is green at Canada Day weekend, that means that we've had the perfect environment almost to condition these sclerotia. The lawns hasn't burnt up. We've had adequate moisture. If you start seeing mushrooms in your lawn, that's also a nice indicator. And you can start to assess the boots on the ground at that point, and the dense, thick canopies, you want to go out there and protect it. So we do have things like Sporecast, and they might be good for the general area. But we've seen fields where, one field it's just covered in white mold, the other field next door, planted at high plant population, zero white mold. So it's always kind of that disease that affects the higher yielding there. So I like grass is green, white mold's keen right around that Canada Day weekend, because that the apothecia is going to be present right around that soybean time.
I would say, and yes, there's a month to go yet, but given how much hay has already been made, we've had a lot of warmth and a lot of moisture. So yes, we'll see how the month goes, but for sure. Now, Chris, you've got another slide here, and we're just about out of time here. But we do have a risk assessment tool coming soon from the Canola Council. Producer Jay, if you would, it is Chris's slide 4. What are we looking at here? What can we hope to see from this? This is pretty cool.
Yeah, so I mean, we talked a lot about all these different factors to measure and try and help figure out all this assessment. And really to monitor this on a field by field basis can be very challenging, especially when you potentially have many fields to scout in a day. So what we wanted to do, and what we've kind of set out to do over the past few years, is take this checklist that, Mike Harding in the video alluded to, and condense it into a tool that's interactive that we could apply based off of a set amount of factors that a user would input, and then actually give a fungicide recommendation, whether to spray or not. So these encompass things such as, the amount of rain you've had in the past couple of weeks, in terms of, what's the forecast that's upcoming, as well as your planting density, that we've touched base about, as well as your history, in terms of how much sclerotia could be present. And then lastly, scouting for that apothecia, those fungus, that's usually the canary in the coal mine in terms of how much Sclerotinia infection you could get. So we had this tool that's been developed over, a few hundred fields, supported by agronomists and growers to help beta test this. And now coming to this June, we're actually going to have it released on our canolacalculator.com website. So we're really excited to actually see that happen. And then the other component of that, of course, is that there's the economics. Does it actually pay to spray? Because there's going to be a lot of cases where, maybe the amount of infection that you'll actually get won't actually cover the cost of your fungicide. So we wanted to kind of, have that other option for that. And usually where it works out to, and what our research is kind of finding us, is that if you're having about 10% of your stems being infected, which usually accounts for a 5% yield loss, that's kind of the threshold in terms of if you want to spray an application or not to be profitable. So more to come for this. It hasn't been published just yet as we're putting the finishing touches, but we're really excited to provide this tool free for use for all growers and agronomists in Western Canada.
Yeah, it's a little hard to see on the screen, but it does have here, you've got the sliding scale for expected price in dollars per bushel and the fungicide cost and application cost in dollars per acre. So yeah, really need to see the economics worked in there, because that of course is, I mean, yes, we all love clean fields, but if it doesn't actually pay to spray, sometimes you just have to deal with some rough spots and know that it left money in the bank account. Before I let you guys go, this has been fantastic. Rob, there's one terrible image that you want to share. And I will preface this with, yes, this is from the Ottawa Valley. Producer Jay, it's Rob's first image there, and it tells a story. So tell me about this field,
Tell,
because
tell,
it looks hurtful.
this is a researcher's dream field right here
Mm,
for white mold and soybeans. So yeah, every field is a test plot. I'll say never farm last year's weather, but in this field, the grower knew that they potentially would be high risk for white mold. They actually have a 4-year rotation, so I believe it was at least 4 years minimum that soybeans have not been planted in this field, and they actually dropped 90,000 plants per acre. So when you think about that, 90,000. So the grower was doing everything right. I think they're 15-inch rows, maybe 20-inch rows, but 90,000 plant population, and they still probably lost upwards of 20-25 bushels. It was actually sprayed with a fungicide, but just ideal conditions. It was like shooting a BB gun at a freight train. It just wasn't too much pressure there. So yeah, in these types of situations, this might be that candidate for where we look at biological control or something like that, because we had wider rotations. Obviously, the soybean variety takes into consideration, but just super high fertility, high yield potential, and knocked off the top 20-25 bushels beans. So, in this situation going into this year, we're probably going to be looking at growing more corn, maybe 2 years of corn, trying to break up that cycle, and then playing around with other things. But next year could be totally different as well.
yeah,
But when you're dropping down to 90,000 plants per acre and still getting that much
already.
pressure,
Yeah.
it kind of, it's
Well,
tough.
and it's also a disease, and I mean, canola is like this too, right? And we hear this, from the Canola Council agronomists, from all agronomists, that especially at either harvest or swath timing, or when you're up above the canopy and you're seeing, spots that are lower yield, or look lower plant population, or look like they've struggled, to go and investigate what happened there, right? To figure out what is actually the driving issue. And certainly here in last year, we saw some just devastated parts of fields with white mold, but not necessarily the entire field. So this is really, it's very ugly. So thank you for sharing that, Rob. And I'm glad I'm not
Right in
growing
your
soybeans.
right in your
Yeah,
backyard, right
yeah,
there.
thanks. It was not my field, everybody. But Chris, maybe that's one of the places we'll end there. I mean, um, given the nature of Sclerotinia, how important is it to, and we talked a little bit about that it can kind of look like something else. How important is it to, collect and clip some stems, perhaps at swath timing, or harvest timing, or even post harvest, to try and get a sense of, what happened, and looking backwards for that field?
It's probably one of the most important things in terms of record keeping to build off or future years. Coming at that kind of end of the season, collecting clippings, you have so many things you could take a look at. Your plant populations at that time, seeing if you have blackleg, verticillium stripe, clubroot, and then of course Sclerotinia. So it's a really good way to actually review that as well. And we actually include a component to that in our risk tool to revisit those fields and actually see if you made the right decision in determining if you left a fungicide check strip or an unspray check strip, to figure that out. So and of course it's a lot easier to walk through those fields when it's all swathed down. For me to try and go and do some disease scouting, when it's fully potted, oh my goodness, it is crazy. But I love it every moment, because it's usually thick crops and it just puts a smile on my face.
What is it? You can, I don't even try to go through it, Chris, when it's fully potted, because I'll just get lost and I won't be able to get through there. But it is something, quite the thing to see when canola is fully potted and all knit together. It's pretty amazing. I'll give soybeans, they are pretty flowers, Rob. I'll give you that. Okay, that's about all you
They're
got.
okay. They abort
They're okay.
70% of them, so they're okay. There's lots out there.
It's okay. Rob, do you have a favorite crop? So it's not soybeans? Or is it?
Corn. I love corn. So
Oh,
and
you know,
you know what?
oh,
I'll give a shout out. I grew up doing a lot of hay when I was younger, and
mm,
there's nothing like a freshly cut field of alfalfa. So I'll give
it's
the
true.
shout out to alfalfa. So
It smells good. I never understood the corn thing till I moved to Ontario and experienced the sound of it growing, like the rustle and the snap, and that, like, you can almost see it and you can hear it, and it is a wonder. So I'll give it that.
and dry
There we
beans
go.
always keep you on your toes too. So I'll do dry beans in there too. So
Yeah, there. Rob, you have to actually pick favorites. Chris is only allowed to say canola, so we'll leave it at that. Okay, thank you both very much. This is it's great to see that we've got some tools coming, and of course, given the weather and given the weather over the next couple weeks, this may be something that's certainly in those regions that have dealt with white mold. It might be another one of those years, so keep you on your toes. But Chris, thanks so much for joining me here on the Agronomists.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, and Rob, thank you as well.
Yep, thanks very much. It was a pleasure.
All right, and thanks to everyone who joined us in the comments. Great to see all the familiar names there. Some fantastic questions and comments. Really appreciate it. Head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists tomorrow to get your CEU credits. And next week, we're going to talk about feeding the corn crop, that delightful corn crop we just talked about. Not just nitrogen, we're going to talk about some other ones as well. So be sure to check back here, 8 p.m. Eastern, Monday night. I'll be back. Cheers, everybody.